All right. Hi, Sandra. Thank you so much for joining me on the Blush and Bloom podcast. So, for someone who's meeting you for the very first time, how do you introduce yourself and the work that you do?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for inviting me on your podcast. It's an honor to be here. Okay, so usually I say that I'm a data scientist with a background in psychology and neuroscience research. I've always been really interested in how data can help us understand people better, and especially in areas like femtech and women's health. Like I'm really passionate about women's health. I've been always reading different books about feminism and gender and such. So yeah, it's been like a real eye opening to see that I can actually use data and technology to apply to my other passion, which is feminism. And I'm also currently pursuing a degree in CBT therapy. So yeah, like a little bit of, of everything. So that's a little bit of coming back to my psychology roots. Because back then in uni, I wasn't that much interested in therapy. I was more into experiments and data and research. So now I'm kind of, maybe it's an age thing. I'm kind of coming back to the therapy side of psychology. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to applying it to help women and women's health.
Okay. That's really cool. But what is CBT therapy?
So it's the cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mhm.
So it's just like a type of a therapy.
Okay. I think my brain is vaguely remembers what this thing is, but it's not clicking just yet. I've heard about it before, though.
Yeah, it's very popular, especially in the UK. I think that's like when you go to a therapist, that's like NHS funded. That's like the first thing that you kind of get because it's very well researched, and it's basically like in a super short phrase, it's basically the idea that the way that you think and your beliefs and the way that you view the world, your like cognitive side, can influence your behavior. So if there's like a certain behaviors that you don't like, it can be changed with changing your beliefs and the way you think about the world and yourself and others and so on. So yeah, that's a super short summary of CBT therapy.
Awesome. Thank you. That sounds very interesting. So you already touched on the women's health bit. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about what pushed you towards being a feminist and also applying your skills towards women's health.
Yeah, so since I remember, I've always been quite sensitive towards inequality, especially, between genders and sexes and so on. And I've always been interested in answering the questions like, okay, but why girls can do this and boys cannot do that? And I think like the more I was growing up, the more I could kind of notice that my upbringing, especially in Eastern Europe, some of the stuff were very kind of gendered and a bit sexist. And, I remember at school, for example, math, like I was never great at math, but I was okay. But I never kind of wanted to push further to learn math because, teachers said once that, oh, like boys are better at math and girls are more into like arts and literature. And, for me, it was just like, okay, yeah, I just took it at face value, when I was like 10 years old, I was like, sure.
Mhm.
So, maybe I could have pushed more in math and maybe study math later on. But I was like, well, I'm a girl, so I guess, so I was growing up and I kind of started to noticing this different ideas about men and women and how it kind of shaped me. So I started reading about it. And then once I read Invisible Women
Mhm.
by Claudia Perez, I had first
Yay! I also have this book.
absolutely love it. It's like my
Yeah.
soul, basically. And this is where I kind of learned about Femtech the first time because there's a chapter when she talks to Ida Tin from Clue and Tanya from Elvie. And this is when, like, I was already at the point of my life when I was transitioning from academia to data science, to technology. And then I was like, wow, so you can actually do kind of like women's health, feminism, and technology and data. And that was like blowing moment. For me. And for me, I was like, that's it. Yeah, that's what I want to do. And it just clicked.
All right. Awesome. That's very cool. And thank you so much for sharing the book as well. I wanted to the next question that popped in my head just now is what are your thoughts on feminism? Because like there's this conversation I used to have with friends around the like I had a conversation with a friend who she at the time she refused to admit that she's a feminist because of the way feminism is often portrayed as women being aggressive and all this other negative connotations of feminism. And then it also reminds me, I can't remember where I read it, but I think because I just thought about Marie Curie and how I've always been a big fan of hers. And I read somewhere that she refused to identify as a feminist during her
Mm.
time because of how it was being presented, but she did identify with feminist values. So I wanted to get a perspective on feminism. How would you describe it?
Yeah, I think there's like a lot of stigma to it. And as you said, like, women who are definitely living the equality and like the feminist dream, they do not want to say open that they're feminist because there's lots of kind of negativity around this term. Like for me, feminism is just literally about equality, right? So it's just as simple as that. Like we basically want men and women to have the same rights, the same kind of treatment socially and at work and professionally and so on. So for me, that's it, right? There are different kind of extremes. There are different kind of like a smaller subgroups, and they definitely take it to like totally different level. But like the most basic definition of feminism is just literally about equality, and that's what I always think about when I hear feminism, and that's what I mean when I say I'm a feminist.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so let's move towards Femtech for Polsku. So can you tell us a bit more about the organization and what you're about?
Yeah, sure. So Femtech for Polsku, so I launched it with my friend Karolina. She's a co-founder, and it's basically an initiative that aims to create a community around Femtech in Poland and maybe Eastern Europe in general in the future. So we both work in Femtech, and we've noticed that in the UK, because this is where I was based and Carolina is still based, there's a bunch of different organizations. You have like Femtech, Women of Wearables, you have Femtech Lab, then you have Femtech Insider, you have like a bunch of different initiatives in states. In Europe as well, there's a Femtech France, for example. So, we haven't seen anything like that in Poland. And we've definitely noticed that, Femtech is, I don't want to say non-existent in Poland, but definitely not in the mainstream. So we decided to start Femtech po Polsku to maybe find another like-minded people in Poland and other founders that, would share our passions and will be willing to build a little community and just help each other out and also maybe popularize it to a wider audience as well.
Very awesome. So thank you so much for sharing that and for sharing the inspiration behind the around it. So another question I have for you is so far from building out the community, what has your observation been about Femtech in Poland so far?
So it's definitely super early for Femtech in Poland, but we are moving quite fast. So Poland currently has around 25-ish active Femtech startups, and they're basically, it's like a small number, right? If you compare it to UK or US or even Germany, it's basically where, for example, Germany was, I guess, 8, 10 years ago. So we have a little bit of catching up to do. However, what we're noticing that there's been a huge growth since 2020, and it's been quite impressive. Like basically the startup started to like pop, like yeah, like quite a lot. So that's great to see. So what also is quite unique to the Polish market is that we see lots of founders with kind of like a science and medical backgrounds versus, in the more developed markets, we see more people from like a business background or just kind of people who are passionate about the field. So maybe it's about the scale. Maybe once we scale up, there's going to be more people that actually know about this stuff and heard about it and are speaking up about their own experience, and that inspires others and themselves to start companies. But so far, a lot of people, they are in the field and they already know the field of
Yeah.
women's health, and that's why they start the companies, because they do notice a need there. So yeah, I think that like also what's exciting about Polish startups, Femtech startups, is that we do have quite a lot of AI and kind of deep tech stuff in comparison to like how many percentage wise, how many companies we have. So, we have companies like Oli, which does, a great hardware product. We have Mint Fertility, which does like the AI IVF product. There's, I don't know if I pronounced it right, but Alice, which is like this super new device that is supposed to detect breast cancer. It's like basically like it looks crazy. It looks like I don't know, compared to like an MRI machine, it's like an actual like thing that you go inside, but it's non-invasive, and it uses also AI to kind of figure out if you are in a risk of a breast cancer. It's still like in a kind of early clinical research stages, but they are pretty innovative, in
Mm.
terms of how many startups we have. It's cool to see that they're like super innovative. It's not just kind of like, menstrual products and things like that, which are also part of it. But yeah, it's just cool to see that we have this innovation going on in Poland. So, maybe we're going to be like a deep tech and tech hub in Central Eastern Europe. Who knows? Yeah.
Considering how fast Poland is growing, very possible.
Yeah.
And I'm happy you already like mentioned a few of the companies because I was going to ask you if you have any favorites. But I think like all these probably like the most popular one right now because I've seen that she got featured on Forbes, and I was like, oh my god, I just like interviewed her daily, and she was so sweet. And I was like, she's on Forbes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, like Kanya's like she's like she's amazing. Like I'm so
Yeah.
impressed by her. Like it's she works so hard and she's so ambitious and no, she's just like a lovely, sweet person as well at the same time. So no, she's awesome. I really, really love her. So yeah, the whole like idea behind it, like you know, in Poland the C-sections are super popular. I think that more than 50% of people, you know, people giving birth in Poland, they are going under C-section. And yeah, like as Sanya said on when she was a guest on your podcast, the scarring is like super very bad. So it's glad we have this kind of device now with Oli. I'm also a big fan of infertility because it's like an AI product. It's like an kind of an algorithm that can. So there's like I think like a couple of AI products. I'm not 100% sure what it is. I would need to check my notes, but it definitely is something to do with helping to pick the best embryos and kind of helping with the whole like IVF process, which can be extremely difficult for couples, and it kind of makes it easier on them, which is great. There's also a very interesting new company called Terrorize, which is an app that basically helps women who are in a toxic relationships. So it's not like a pure femtech, let's say, in terms of health, but it definitely is big on mental health. And I think that femtech, you know, I know that it kind of is mainly about women's health, but I would also consider Femtech an app that, for example, does financing health, like advice for women and so on. So I think that, you know, it's quite broad. So it's great to see this kind of initiatives coming up in Poland as well.
Yeah. I also love that you mentioned how diverse the offerings are in terms of what femtech can look like, because I think this is very important because initially when I started the podcast, I had what I imagined femtech was mostly apps like Clue. And
Yeah.
then when I started like interviewing like so many founders building in this space, I realized that okay, it can manifest in so many different directions. There is like you said, the deep tech side of things. People are using AI for some things. Some people are
Mm.
doing mental health. Some people are using it to support women who are going through domestic violence and how to support them through all of that. So it's really, really impressive. And there's like all these studies around endometriosis and PCOS and all this other like even aging and supporting women with dementia. Like it's so cool how it's such a very broad field, and it's crazy that some people actually describe it as niche when really it's
Right? Like, what is this about?
yeah. All right. Thank you. And now my next question is going to be around you and your experience in data science. So
Mhm.
you've actually worked, I think you worked with Elvie, I think.
Ye- Yeah.
So I think isn't Elvie like one of the biggest? I think you mentioned their name already. Like they're one of the
Yeah.
popular
Yeah.
startup companies. So what was your experience like there? Like,
So Elvie, like, unfortunately, like, they still exist, but they went under administration this year. So now I think they're
oh,
part of Willow, which is another company that does like a smart breast pumps, but they still exist. Like it's a different. Some of the core team from the UK is still there, but and the brand is still there, but it's like a bit different than the company I worked for. If that makes sense. So LV, as you mentioned, like it was a bit different because LV was a big fintech startup, right? So it had already gone for like an A, B, C funding grants and so on. So usually the fintech companies, they are still like in like the early like seed, pre-seed round, maybe A funding stage and so on. So I think like what happened, like what I kind of noticed is that once you scale up to a certain level, like as big as I guess LV gets, maybe as big as like Flow is and so on, I think that it's very important to kind of keep your integrity in your product. You know, once you have this investors, once you have the VC people, like it can get a little bit more about, okay, how do we please
prioritize shareholder value.
exactly the shareholders, how do we keep like, you know, and it's natural because, you know, you do need the money to keep coming, right? Because
Mm.
also with Femtech, you do need to do your own research because lots of the data is just not out there. So you have to go for your own clinical trials and so on. And it takes time and it takes money. So,
Mhm.
you know, the investor has to be patient because, you know, they invested in you and they have to understand that the return may happen much later if it will happen at all. Because what if the research that you're just doing, because there's none of the research has been done before. What if it says something that's not like in congruency with your product and you have to just change the concept, right? So I think that's like one thing. Once you kind of scale up, you have to be very careful to like stay true to yourself. Another thing I learned is that the team is super important, like the people you work with and the people you pick for your company. Everyone at Elvie was like so extremely passionate about women's health and the company's mission. And I think it's just crucial to pick the people that really like people who would like get you and get the idea and become passionate about your product and your mission as well. Obviously skills are super important as well. But you know, if I were a founder, if I would to hire someone that's like super skilled but doesn't care about my mission versus someone who's very promising, skilled, and passionate, then obviously I would go for someone who shares the passion and the interest in the field.
That makes sense. And thank you so much for sharing that background because I had no idea. And I think this is another conversation I've had with a few founders and some investors is that like it's easy like okay, not like it's easy. It's not easy to get funding in women's health to begin with. So also prioritizing that your company eventually will get controlled by so many people, the more shares you're giving out. And it's important to like have that kind of protection so that at the end of the day, the main mission behind the company still remains relevant.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
In Femtech, like lots of people start companies
Mhm.
because of their lived experience. So it is very
Yeah.
personal to them. There's like a specific problem they hold dear and that they want to solve.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, it's tricky. Easier said than done.
Yeah.
Like you said, money is needed for all these things. So maybe there maybe there will be some kind of solution going forward. Okay, so more on data science questions regarding you. So you could you please like share more about your journey into data science? Like how did you get started and what pushed you into it towards doing more of data related work?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I did some psychology and neuroscience at uni, and then I've always wanted to do experimental psychology, right? So after my master's degree, I started working as a research assistant, and this is when I kind of started to work with data on a daily basis. So, you know, we had participants, we were doing the research, the tests, and I had to analyze the data. This is the time when I that was the time I used lots of statistics. So I noticed I really, really like it and enjoy working with data. At the same time, I was noticing that like the higher you go in academia, the less of the actual research and data and analysis you do. You're more like, you know, more like a manager for
Yeah.
the researchers, right? And also, I kind of became maybe disillusioned with the whole, you know, academia field and so on. Like it seems great. I always had like this dream of like doing you know, research and lecturing and stuff. But reality is that the field is like any field in academia in general, like is super competitive. Like there's so many people, you know, getting PhDs, studying like for years and then basically not being able to get a job because there's too many people and like not that many posts at the university, right? So at the same time, I had friends, colleagues who were finishing their PhDs and basically being unemployed. And it was the time when I was kind of considering starting a PhD. And, you know, I had to kind of sit down and ask myself what I really want, what kind of lifestyle I'd like. Oh, yeah, it so happened that at the same time, there was the pandemic, COVID happened. And the working from home kicked in, and I was like, I can get used to that. I kind of enjoy that. And obviously, when you're in academia, you have to be there for the research and as a lecturer as well. So I decided to do a bit of a field change. And since I already did like lots of data and Python at work as a research assistant, I learned about data science and I was like, well, it sounds like super similar, just commercial data and, you know, private companies. And I also kind of read and asked around a lot, and lots of people in academia were actually doing this transition. So I was kind of like learning data science, doing different work on my portfolio and so on. And I was very lucky that Elvie actually was looking for a junior data scientist at the same time. So I wrote them, I guess, extremely desperate cover letter. Yeah, I have to work for you guys, like, and it worked. So yeah, they hired me, and yeah, it was very interesting because the team back then was 7 other data scientists, and they all actually transitioned from academia. So they were all like already they've done their PhDs and they've done their, you know, research
Fancy.
and so on, and then they kind of came back to data science. So it just seemed like a natural.
That's very awesome. Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. And okay, now leaning on your data science background, I think we talked a bit about this on LinkedIn before this call around how data is managed across femtech companies. So what are your thoughts? Because I've had this conversation with a few podcast guests before about their thoughts on data privacy, because this is a very important topic when it comes to women's health, because we do want more data points around women's health, but at the same time, there's all these privacy issues, and we don't want the data that women are supplying to be used against them. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so yeah, like that's crucial, right? To
Yeah.
build the trust with your user. And I think that even recently Flo had like a case in court, right? Because of how they were selling their data to Google and Meta and so on. And yeah, I think this is not acceptable, right? Like there's yeah, it's really tough because I get that like you as a company you need to make money, and like selling data is so common and so widespread, and I guess seems like everyone is doing it in other fields, and people are not aware about it yet. I think they're like now slowly kind of waking up to like, oh my God, like my data is getting sold. Like I have to be careful what I put out there. But if it comes to like, women's health and this very delicate, very personal stuff, I think that there should be some kind of wider ban on it, right? Like in Europe, we do have like the some GDPR things. And for example, Clue, they had to obey this, right? I think that's literally the solution. There has to be the governments, they have to mandate that it has to be legally protected. Because I think companies sooner or later, if they can, obviously, femtech is a bit of a different field because it comes from like a lived experience, and people are passionate about it, and it's not just for money. But definitely I can see how like in other fields, if they can sell the data, they probably will do it. There is this video I watched with Mark Zuckerberg, beginning of Facebook, right? And there's this
Yeah.
interviewer, and like she's asking him like, oh, are you going to sell data? He's like, I'll never sell data, like I won't do it. But, fast forward like 10 years yet, and he did it. So I think that companies cannot be trusted at a certain level, even such like a great companies like within Femtech. I think as a user, you should have a little bit of a kind of like a, red alarm in your head when you share your data, and just do your research and check. But it's
Yeah.
also unfair that this is on the user side. It should be mandated. The companies, they have to oblige, and they need to do their due diligence to protect those data.
When you raised this thing about how Flo was able to like do all of that, but Crew could never because of the regulations within Europe. I think that's another thing about companies in Europe, and I've seen like conversations around how like it's better to like start your company in the US because there's less of this
Yeah.
bureaucracy for you to deal with. But in the end, it may slow down innovation a little bit because you have so many like hoops to cross and all that. But at the same time, it's protecting users.
Yeah. I mean, selling data, I don't see how this is innovation, because
Yeah.
you, you do your product, you do your innovation before you actually get the people to use it. Like ideally, right? Like you
Yeah.
should have your product figured out and already well researched, and then you give it to people. And this is some like, yeah, just like a different revenue stream for a company, which like should not be the case, right?
Yeah, especially I think I don't think it applies to Europe, but I think it's a chaotic situation with the US where they're having all these issues with women getting charged for is it murder in the case of a miscarriage that's not even
I
their fault. I mean it's
absolutely.
never their fault, but like it's just insane how it's like when you just open the news and you open and you just like see what is happening, it's like, are we evolving backwards or something? What is
Yeah, precisely. This is how I feel sometimes. Like everyone just decided to like go back to, I don't know, Middle Ages. I don't know, because like it's crazy that we have all of this progress, and like so many groups like worked and fought so hard for their right, and now it can be all taken away like this, and it's scary. And right now it's the US, but there's a trend in Europe and all over the world, like looking at the politics even in Poland and Germany and so on, like we are going towards that way, right? Like kind of taking women's rights, going more right wing, and so on. So sure, right now it's in the US, but maybe in the future someone will decide to use Clue to see if someone miscarried, right? So it is like, as like a government level. So yeah, I mean this is very dystopian, and I hope it will never come to this. But yeah, in the current times, it's not that difficult to imagine, isn't it? And it's scary.
I agree. Okay, let's talk on more positive sides of impact. Okay, so I'm trying to find a more positive sounding question because that just discussed was okay. So, what gaps in women's health do you feel like, is there any space within women's health that you feel is underserved and could deserve more? I mean, almost all the aspects of women's health are under researched. So
Yeah.
is there a particular one that you have like interest in that you'd be like, oh, it'd be great if more focus was supposed to put on this one?
Yeah. So as you said, like everything really needs attention. Uh, so I was definitely thinking about like for me, one of the biggest question is like, how does the environment shape women's health data? Because we're making progress understanding the women's biology. We do finally start to include hormone cycles and like sex specific physiology in our research. But that's only like one part of the picture. What we often don't look at is how environment, lifestyle, culture, all of it can influence that biology. One of the examples is how women in Japan, they report fewer menopause symptoms than women in the West. And yeah, and basically aging and menopause is framed totally differently as a culture than here. Like it's less like stigmatized in Japan than it is in the West. And there was also this research, it's very interesting. Apparently there's like a very high obviously there's like a very high soy consumption in Japan and in Asia. And apparently there's this like naturally occurring thing in soy that resembles estrogen. And there is this theory that basically because they eat so much soy, they do have like very weak version of hormonal replacement therapy. Doesn't kind of have less of the symptoms. But this is just for instance, right? So why are we not asking those questions, like how environment is influencing the symptoms and women's health? So yeah, we're so focused on biological data, like all of the blood markers, hormones, genetics, and so on, that we I think really think about the environmental context. And that's probably like the next in line too. Once we understand women's health very well, I guess then we can look, okay, but now let's go deeper. Let's not just look at women's health. Let's check women in Japan, women in Poland, women in wherever. So yeah, I think that the environment has like a big influence on women's health. But even at the study I read recently, like if you live in a country with a high air pollution, it influences the length of your cycle. I think it prolongs it if I remember correctly. So I guess it's a huge influence, and not even, don't even get me started on climate change, microplastics, and so on. So that's one of the areas I think that would be very interesting to research more.
I mean, it sounds pretty obvious,
Yeah.
but who's really taking it that direct? I mean, some things are just it's obvious, but then you never really like put into perspective sometimes.
Yeah, because then like you get data from some researchers, or like and sure, like in like academic environment, you try to get rid of as many confounding variables as you can to kind of make data as clear as possible. But then you don't know, maybe certain participant had an experience that influenced this data and the other one didn't, and like it's yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I need to ponder on this topic a bit more because that is very valid. I think this even came up in one of the podcast episodes I did with one of the doctors in Nigeria, how like we're talking about how I can't seem to remember anything today, huh? We were just talking about how it's a bit different for African women, the way we experience like periods and all these other things, and there are higher cases of fibroids and some other things compared to other places. And then yeah, that was where the conversation was going. We need to look into what factors are there, genetic factors, environmental factors that result in why women in certain areas tend to have certain things. Like why do Black women tend to have diabetes more, or Black in general? Is there maybe something else, not just a genetic disposition, that kind of thing? So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's like a kind of like a level down, right? If I imagine women's health, like we're kind of like just going down the stairs, and it's
Mhm.
kind of further down in the basement, right?
Yeah,
Right now we just have to find out like in general, like what's happening, and then we can kind of dig deeper.
that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think we are headed towards the end of the podcast now. So I'm just going to ask you some generic data science questions now because yay, data science. So
Yeah.
for somebody who is entering data science in this crazy age of AI, where AI can do almost any, because at this point, I think when I was like starting out in data science, it was a lot of Jupyter notebooks. And then I realized that, okay, then people don't really care for the Jupyter notebooks and spreadsheets and stuff anymore. They're asking you to like push it to production and all that stuff. And then
Mhm.
I don't know what the data science, the day-to-day of a data scientist is going to look like right now, because from what I've talked to my friends about, it's tending towards more deployment type stuff.
Yeah.
So, and integrating APIs from like ChatGPT and some other things. But I guess it varies from different company to company. Anyway, from your perspective, what advice would you give somebody who is like they want to start data science today?
Yeah, so I definitely what you said. So I can definitely see that the field changing. So when I was studying data science, like in 2020, yeah, like 5 years ago, yeah, like it was all about like, oh, can you build a supervised learning model and
Yeah.
can you do this and can you do like database? So yeah, and now it's all about very often about LLM, not all the time. It is still about building good scalable models, but
Mm.
there's way more ML ops and there's more deployment. And so that used to be data engineering, right? Like back in my
Yeah.
day. So now it kind of all merges, right? So
Yeah.
I definitely noticed that nowadays you have to be definitely a little bit of a jack of all trades. So
Yeah.
data science. So it is all of the stuff that used to be valid. So you still have to know your ML models. You still need to know your neural nets and deep learning and so on. Then also the LLM stuff, how you can use the APIs, how to apply it, how to validate it, how to test it, how to build systems like RAG and how to tune it and so on. And then also on top of it, it's good to know the whole ML ops side of it. So how do you deploy the model? How do you monitor the model? Yeah, so it basically became even more difficult now because you still have to know all of the like more traditional data science stuff,
Mm.
and statistics also are very helpful, I think. Plus, the new ML DevOps, and I think it's shifting the whole field. Like I recently, even I'm not even seeing data science like job offers. It says more like exactly right. I'm like something like that. So it's changing. So I think that you just need to kind of try and find what you enjoy and see how you can apply it. But it is like a little bit unfair because the mostly like the commercially used LLMs and such, they are paid, right? Like in order to use like OpenAI API, like you have to pay. So you know I think the same like if you want to use like AWS or Snowflake. I'm not sure if there's like some free tier, but as far as I'm aware, like majority of the stuff you actually have to pay to use it. So in order to learn it, I think right now you have to invest more money into
Mm.
it because the tools are unfortunately they're paid. And sure, there's like the freely available ones as well, but then the companies they don't usually use it. Like from my freelance work, like everyone usually uses OpenAI. There was this one company that kind of was thinking about deploying their own LLM, like not their own, like the freely available one, I think it was Llama on AWS, but that's like super expensive, right? So yeah, so it's tricky. I mean, it's never been easy, but I think now it just added the extra level
Yeah.
just to kind of cheer everyone up. There's a lot of competition that don't know how to program, and they just literally use like ChatGPT to so that happens as well. And then, I did have a case, one of the companies I freelanced for, like they had this guy and it took them like 2 months to figure out he actually doesn't know how to program. And they're still using ChatGPT to do everything. So there are also this, people out there. So, maybe maybe if you do your studying and due diligence and your portfolio and stuff, maybe you're in a good position to actually get a nice job.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And it reminds me of the conversation I was having with a friend, and we were talking about how this is like the worst time to be a beginner at anything because the companies are tending towards hiring somebody who is a senior that can use ChatGPT, but then since they're a senior, they know what good code is going to look like, and then they know when ChatGPT is generating unnecessary
Mm.
line code. So that is absolutely horrible for a beginner because you don't know what good code looks like until you've coded for some time. So
Yeah, I agree, 100%.
yeah. So fingers crossed for everybody because this is fun. And then I don't know if you saw that whole diagram about the AI bubble, like all the companies are just like funding each other.
Yeah, yeah, like the bubbles gonna burst. Yeah, but I just like I did hear the statistic that's quite scary. Like 80% of all of the like companies, AI projects and stuff, they fail or like they're not exactly right. So yeah, like I've like all of the new technologies, like there's this curve, right? So like right now we're still like on the rising hype, and soon it's kind of gonna stabilize as we're gonna go down. People will be like, oh, actually, it's not as good as we thought, and then it will kind of plateau. So right now I think we're still rising because the products that are coming out, like the whole like the new videos and the AI video making stuff, like the Sora 2, all of that, like wow, like it's we keep getting more, but it has to stop, one day. Even like scientifically, like logically, like we only have a certain amount of data to
Mm.
feed into the model, and we have a certain amount of computational power that we can use currently. So it will stop eventually. But what's going to happen with everyone's job until then? Who knows? Interesting times. Interesting times.
Yeah. very interesting times. And what you just said about the job part, it reminded me of this. I don't know if you follow, I think her name is Daliana. She used to work at, I think in Meta or somewhere, one of the FANG companies or so. So she has this newsletter and then she posted on the newsletter that like if you think you have a full-time job, you're kidding. You're basically a freelancer in a contract that gives you the assumption that I'm paraphrasing a bunch, but that's the way I understood it. She wasn't as she wasn't as direct as I'm saying it, but it's basically you're a glorified freelancer who has the assumption that they have a full-time contract. Like,
Yeah.
it's best to position it that it's she was basically advising that it's best for professionals now to position themselves more as contractors and then do a lot of marketing, know how to handle those contracts when you get clients and how to
Mm.
market yourself and do all this. Basically position yourself as a proper freelancer because the way I think from what I read, if I remember correctly, she's saying that there'll be less chances of full-time jobs and more of contract freelance things going on. But
Yeah.
we'll see because there's so many layoffs. So it sounds like a fair assumption.
It is, yeah. And from what I'm seeing as well, like, from like my friends and like my colleagues and so on. Yeah, it's like, one day, even, Elvie also went for like a few rounds of redundancies before I left. And, it was like all nice and dandy. And we're just, going around our business and we think everything's great. And suddenly you have this call in your calendar and like they hire like 20% of people. So, and it's, it happens a lot.
Mm.
In Eastern Europe, it's a bit different though, because we have like very good like workers kind of rights and so on. So you kind of need to have like a good reason to fire someone, as far as I'm aware. But like on like US is even worse. US they can just fire you like on the spot. As far as I'm aware, like in UK they still have some like rules and so on. But basically, a private company can fire you anytime. So with freelancing, right? Like for example, I have my own company and I freelance, kind of like business to business. And I know how much money I have in my company. I know when I need to start looking for a new project, and I feel like I'm more in control. With the full-time employment. Sure, like you have the salary coming in every month, but then whatever suddenly stops, right? And you don't know when it can stop because the company won't tell you. I think usually they don't tell you that something's going on. They will keep you in the dark until the last moment.
Yeah. Great. So I'm really loving this conversation. So I'm going to ask the next couple of, we have very little time left. So I'm going to ask like 2 or 3 more questions. So I see you have a lot of books. I am super excited by that. I thought that the white one was Sapiens, but it's not. I actually did the zoom in, but because it looked like the white binding of the book by Yuval Noah Harari, but I don't think
Oh
it's
no, no, I don't have.
no.
No.
It's in Polish.
We Polish and in the English books.
Very cool. So I'm going to ask you, do you have one particular book that changed your perspective that you like to share?
Yes, I already mentioned this one, and I think this is the one that changed my
Right.
perspective the most. Really, really love the Menopause Manifesto by Dr. John Gunther. So she's great. So she basically talks about like women's health, and she's a gynecologist. And yeah, it's not the easiest of reads because it is like pretty dense in terms of like science and facts, but just the way that it talks about menopause and like what happens with it. Yeah, I kind of didn't know a lot of it in the past, and kind of reading this book kind of made me feel like maybe I want to pursue this field of women's health a bit more. And basically, part why I'm doing my psychotherapy degree is that like one of the things that is good for menopause and like the dealing with the symptoms is the going to behavioral therapy. So after reading this book, I'm like, well, maybe I can do my therapy bit and then I can kind of focus on helping women going through menopause and kind of trying to ease their symptoms if, you know, to just have another option than pharmacological stuff, or maybe they don't want to take it, or maybe they're taking it and they need like some extra help from a therapist. So yeah, so that's a very interesting book that I would recommend.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like I would have asked you more questions around your psychotherapy work, but let's see. Maybe, maybe you'll be on another podcast and the person asking more questions. Anyway, or we could do another one. We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay, so my next question is going to be, it's basically one of my favorite questions to ask on this podcast. What would you tell 15-year-old Sandra?
Yeah, to just like to chill and just like calm down because I was so impatient. I was like, oh, I need to figure out this one thing I want to do in my life that I'm gonna be doing till the end of my life. And
Yep.
it's now or never. And I'm 15, so I have to pick my subjects for my A levels, and then it will determine my university choice, what I'm gonna study. So I have to know everything right now. And I remember I was so like stressing out over it because I really thought I have to have everything figured out. So yeah, I would just tell myself to just calm down, like live a little, see what I like. And, I did end up changing my field, and it kind of really showed me that you can do it, and anyone could do it literally any time in their life if they're unhappy in, what they do right now, or if they see a different direction for themselves. They can just go and change it, right? And you don't have to have anything figured out when you're 15 or 20 or 30. I think like life is long, and you can still change things around.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And that's this responses like this is a reminder why I asked these questions in the first place, because this is basically why when you're younger, there's like a limited amount of information you have access to, but yet you want to like decide where your entire future is going to be with
Yeah,
a
right.
small amount of information.
Yeah, because it's like systemic. Because then, like, I don't know how it is like in other countries, but like in Poland, like you go to a specific like high school, and then you choose your profile. And if, for example, if you choose like math, you have more hours of math and less hours of like biology, right? But what if you then decide, oh, I actually want to do my A levels in biology and become a doctor? Well, you can still do it, but then you are missing out on one of these extra hours you could have in biology, right? So it is a bit unfair. And another thing I guess I would have done is maybe wait a little bit before going to uni, just to like go out there and maybe try different things. But I think with families and parents, it's like there's such a huge push of like you have to get your education, have to get your degree, and you have to do it as soon as possible. Yeah, so maybe just taking some time and just like exploring a bit would be great.
All worked out though.
I did, yeah. I mean, I think it always works out really. Like,
Yeah.
I think everyone just finds themselves in the right place eventually. So
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much for sharing that. And now my final question is going to be for listeners who want to connect with you and learn more about you and your work and Femtech for Polsku, where can they find all the information?
yeah, so I'm mostly on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. Just like Google and search my name on LinkedIn, Sandra Machoń, and the Femtech Polsku as well. So we have Instagram, we have LinkedIn, so it's all the same handle, Femtech Polsku. And we also have a podcast on Spotify. So we released the first season. It's in Polish, and it's mostly focusing around like women's health and Femtech, and a bit of like a situation in Poland currently with women's health and so on. So yeah, I'm encouraging everyone to listen to that as well if they want to learn more about Femtech in Poland. And lastly, we will be releasing a website soon. So it's going to be femtechpo.pl. And yeah, so all the information will be on LinkedIn. So we won't miss it. But yeah, primarily LinkedIn.
Awesome. I will include all the links in the show notes and in the description. So thank you so much, Sandra. It's been awesome having you on the podcast. And this part I'll say thank you about it.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure and such a great conversation.